And I'm like, where is everybody? And he's like, there's the Blue Jay game. It's like game 7. This is big. And he's like, you can just leave. I waited an extra 10 minutes. And then finally I was packing my stuff up, and a family shows up. They walk in. There's 5 of them. And I'm like, oh, you guys didn't watch the game? They're like, oh, no, it just ended. We live across the street. So anyways, we just had a conversation instead of a talk. So I'm glad you guys are here. All right, so we're all hooked up here. I'm with a ministry called Stand to Reason. Anyone heard of Stand to Reason before? A few of you. Stand to Reason, we're an apologetics ministry, okay? And apologetics is not going around telling people you're sorry for being a Christian, okay? We make other people sorry we're Christians. No, we don't do that either, okay? There are some Christians that do that, and they shouldn't, okay? No, we give a defense for the Christian faith. That's all we're doing, okay? Kind of like when I describe apologetics, I want people to think of like a lawyer standing in front of a judge and jury. And what does a lawyer do? They kind of make their case. They give arguments, maybe counter arguments, this kind of thing. So that's what Christian apologetics is all about. And that's what I do with these guys. And they're in California, where the weather is always nice. Toronto, -20, okay? So I also started about 1.5 years ago a thing called Red Pen Logic with Mr. B. Anyone familiar with Red Pen Logic? Okay, very cool. So it started with me just responding to some graphics, some memes, putting my red pen. I used to be a full-time high school teacher, and then kind of got into this whole world. And so we started that, and then we started making videos, and the videos have just like blown up. And I think that's not because of me, but because of the need that's out there to answer challenges. And our kids, I have 3 little kids, okay, 3 little girls, a 10-year-old, an 8-year-old, and a 5-year-old. So you got to pray for me, all right? Pray for my wife, who's home with them right now. They're not on social media yet, but they will be. And they're going to be seeing a lot of stuff that's out there. So I started a TikTok account like 3 months ago. It has 100,000 followers, okay? Like some of the videos have millions of views. And that's, again, I think because people are desperate for responses to the challenges they're seeing out there. I'm just responding to the atheists and the progressives, the progressive Christians, that kind of thing. And so anyways, you can go to Red Pen Logic, just Google it, and you'll see different things come up there, all right? All right, anything else? Oh yeah, we do a student conference. I don't know what the closest one would be for you guys. I think it's the Georgia one that's coming up in the fall. I don't know if I can even see in April, 22nd, 23rd, is that particular conference in, where they do the golf thing? Augusta, Georgia, okay? So that's where that might be the closest one for you guys, but we'll be in Pennsylvania. We will be in Texas in February. The last one we did was in Minneapolis. We had 3,300 students at one apologetics conference. People said, you can't get students to come to an apologetics conference where you're just giving them information about God's existence, facts about the resurrection, this kind of thing. Oh, no. We made a student conference that students actually like to come to, okay? So that's kind of neat. And then we also, last like kind of commercial, but it's not really commercial because I'm telling you about stuff that honestly you're going to use. There is a thing we've created called STRU, like STR University, totally free courses, okay? You just go to the website, training.str.org, put in your email. I think that's all it asks for. And then you get full courses. Like we just uploaded 2 new courses. One's on atheism called Bumping into Reality, and the other one is on the problem of evil, okay? I have 2 on there, one on truth and one on apologetics in general. There's some others, okay? And I'm actually next week recording another one on the resurrection in Missouri. So there you go. Okay, let's talk about mermaids. You guys thought we were going to talk about something else, didn't you? Well, we're talking about mermaids. I want to start with a story. So one day, it's a true story. This was about 1 year ago. my daughter Jocelyn, who's now 8, but she was 7 at the time, she comes up to me, and I'm working away, and she says, can you ask Siri a question for me? And I replied, how about I try to answer your question for you, honey? After all, your daddy is a professional apologist, right? I answer questions for a living, or at least try to. And she responded, okay, are mermaids real? Are mermaids real? I thought this is an easy one. No, honey, mermaids are not real. Now, I was busy working. I didn't sugarcoat it, okay? And normally, sometimes not so like in your face. But I'm like, no, honey, mermaids aren't real. Now, she was not satisfied with my answer. And she says, Dad, you don't know everything. Ugh. She's 7 years old. Now she already realizes Daddy doesn't know everything. Can you ask Siri just to be sure? Reluctantly, I pull out my phone. Siri, are mermaids real? Siri says, not that I know of. Now, I'm going to try and pull a fast one on my daughter here, okay? Because she's 7. I'm like, see? Siri agrees with me. Mermaids aren't real. Now, my daughter, this particular daughter, is going to be like an engineer or something, okay? Like, she is constantly building. Like, we got an Amazon Alexa, and she started building one herself, okay? Now, it was mostly just glue and, string, and she found some wires and put it inside, and she's like, can we plug it in? I'm like, no, honey, do not plug that thing in. But it's just really cute. Okay, she said, and so she realizes what I'm doing. She says, Dad, Siri said she doesn't know if mermaids are real. Then she says, can you ask Siri to ask Google? Google will know. And I'm thinking, okay. The point is, we all want to know what's true, right? And that's why we start asking all these kinds of questions. And it starts when we're really small, and it has to do with questions about like mermaids, those kind of questions. But as we get older, the questions get deeper. They become like the big questions of life. Why am I here? Is there purpose and meaning to life? Does God exist? That seems like an important question, whether or not he exists. What happens after I die? Those kinds of questions. And as you start to answer those questions, whether you realize it or not, you're actually forming a worldview. God exists? Okay, I'm bringing that piece in. Jesus is the Son of God. Okay, that's coming in over here. And you start to form, almost like a puzzle. You form your worldview. But then something happens. You begin to doubt some of those pieces of the puzzle. You begin to doubt part of that worldview. After all, we don't know everything, right? As my daughter reminded me. We're finite creatures. Sometimes we get things wrong, right? Some of us will admit it. And even that possibility can cause us to experience doubt, okay? Doubt about God, doubts about the Bible, doubts about our faith. Now, what I want to do is, as we go through this, is I want to respond to this question about doubt. What if I'm wrong? This kind of thing. I want to respond as if I'm talking with my own kids, because that's how I'm thinking about this. What happens when Juliana, my 10-year-old, comes to me in 10 years and says, Dad, I don't know if God exists anymore? What does Daddy say to Juliana? What does Dad say when little Allison, who's 5 right now, is 15, and she says, Dad, the kids at school, they all think that Christianity is so intolerant. It's so unloving. We're all a bunch of hypocrites. I don't know if I want to be a part of that. What is Daddy going to say? You know what I'm saying? So I'm looking at parents here, but I'm also looking at students. So I'm kind of responding to both of you guys. We all have doubts. They start when you're a student, and frankly, I still have some, okay? But I'm also thinking about how I would communicate some of these ideas to the next generation. Okay, so the first thing I would want to tell my daughter if she came to me with doubts, or maybe you're here and you have some doubts, is I want you to know everyone doubts. That's the first thing. Everyone doubts. This is not merely a Christian thing. This is a human thing. If you are a human being, you experience doubts. Even skeptics have doubts. Now, you guys know who C.S. Lewis is, right? C.S. Lewis was a brilliant Christian, but he wasn't always a Christian. He was an atheist, actually, until he was an adult. And he eventually became a Christian, a theist first, then a Christian, and he kind of describes that in his book, Mere Christianity, kind of the arguments that led him towards that, the moral argument in particular. But in his book, Mere Christianity, he says, now that I'm a Christian, I do have moods in which the whole thing looks very improbable. Stop right there. C.S. Lewis had some doubts. He had moods, he calls them, where he thinks the whole thing is very improbable. But he says, but when I was an atheist, I had moods in which Christianity looked terribly probable. What's he saying? Same thing we're getting at. Everyone doubts. When C.S. Lewis was an atheist, he had doubts too. It's like, maybe this Christianity stuff is true, right? So that's the first point. Here's the second thing. Now, doubt is no respecter of persons. It comes for all of us. Everyone doubts. But here's another piece of that. Not all doubts are equal. Not all doubts are equal. Some are justified and some aren't. For example, you know there are some people, and maybe you've met some of these people, that don't believe that the external world exists, okay? They believe that we exist in like the Matrix or something. You remember the Matrix movie? I think they redid, like they did a number 4 or something recently. So we're like in a dream world, something like that. Now that to me is an unjustified doubt. There is no reason to deny my experience of the real world. You are real people. I'm up here talking to real people. And to say that I'm not is unjustified. It's crazy, okay? And the people that hold this view are, mostly philosophers and maybe have spent too much time thinking about this. But there's other doubts that I think are justified. For example, Darwin. When Darwin wrote his book, Charles Darwin, famous book on the Origin of Species, really popularized the idea of evolution. He says in a letter to his friend, William Graham, listen to this. But then with me, the horrid doubt always arises. So he's got a doubt here. A horrid doubt always arises. Whether the convictions of man's mind, which have been developed from the mind of lower animals, are of any value or at all trustworthy. Would anyone trust in the convictions of a monkey's mind if there are any convictions in such a mind? What Darwin doubted was this idea that how can I even trust my own thinking if my thinking is the result of just survival of the fittest? Over time, evolution, getting to this point now, where now I have faculties that actually kind of work towards truth, okay? And so I actually think this is the kind of doubt that was justified. In fact, atheist Steven Pinker, he says our brains were shaped for fitness, not truth, according to evolution. Sometimes the truth is adaptive and sometimes it's not. So then why would we trust that our faculties are rational, that they will lead us towards truth if this is how they came about? And I think on this kind of naturalistic evolution, there isn't any reason to trust your rational faculties. There just isn't. That's just so there's an example of an irrational, an unjustified doubt and a justified doubt, okay? They both exist. So the first thing is everybody doubts, but not all doubts are equal. Don't treat them all as if they're the same. Now, let's talk about what this thing is, this doubt thing, before we go too deep, okay? What is doubt? Well, you need to know that doubt is not the opposite of faith. I think this is kind of a popular misconception. People think that if you are doubting, then you don't have faith. But that's just not true. Doubt is not the opposite of faith. The opposite of faith is unbelief. Belief, unbelief, okay? That's the opposite. So doubt is something different. In fact, biblically speaking, here we got James, talks a little bit about doubt. He says doubt is a state of being in two minds, okay? He says double-minded, unstable in all his ways in James 1, verse 8. Here's an analogy that I came up with. Maybe it works, maybe it doesn't. When I think of doubting, being unstable in all your ways, I think of standing in two canoes. Has anyone ever stood up in a canoe, just like one canoe? Kind of difficult, right? Kind of rocky, kind of unstable. Imagine standing in two canoes, one in each canoe. One is like belief and one's unbelief. That's kind of that place. You can't stay there long. You can't stay there long. And what you find is you talk to people who doubt, when those doubts come, they either end up taking the step into the belief category or into the unbelief category. Okay? Doubt is always taking you somewhere. And that's why I kind of titled this talk, Doubting Towards God. That's where we want you to go, towards God. Okay, so you have this idea. Now, doubt is not merely just a mind thing. I think as the Bible describes it, it's not just being uncertain. Because I'm uncertain about lots of stuff that I'm not doubting. Okay, I'm just uncertain. Doubt isn't just a mind thing. I think it's a whole person thing. Someone once said, the heart of doubt is a divided heart. Okay, the heart of doubt is a divided heart. And what they mean is it divides your whole being. And that's why people describe it as being like in distress or anguish. You talk to someone who is suffering doubt, not just asking questions, but really doubting, and it's like they're going through something big. And so I wrote here as my definition, an anguished state of being in two minds, okay? Like it hurts. Now, here's something I wish that we would tell more young Christians in particular. Because like right now, there's a movement called the Deconstruction Movement happening, okay? If you've heard of the word deconstruction, maybe you haven't. The idea is, and I think deconstruction is different than doubt. We can talk about this in Q&A. But it's the idea that your beliefs have been constructed. Think of like Jenga. You guys know Jenga, right? And as you take all these pieces apart, you're deconstructing. Here's my belief that Jesus was born of a virgin. Take it out. Let me deconstruct. And what you end up doing is looking at all this stuff, and you go right down to the floor with all your beliefs. God's existence, resurrection. Doesn't matter what the belief is. You hold it, you deconstruct it. Okay? What I think is dangerous, and I'm seeing like people I know on social media saying, go out, deconstruct. You'll have a stronger faith at the end of it. Maybe. Some deconstruction leads to a stronger faith. That's true. But I would never encourage someone to go deconstruct because deconstruction, like doubt, is dangerous. It's dangerous if you don't know what you're doing, if you don't do it right. It'd be like handing a sharp knife to my 5-year-old. Say, go run around, have fun. No, that's dangerous. She may have fun, but she may end up hurting herself, right? So it's dangerous because here's the thing. It can lead to belief or it can lead to unbelief. It's dangerous, but it doesn't have to be fatal. It doesn't have to be. In fact, I've gone through periods of doubt, and I think my faith has come out even stronger. So I can testify to that. But I would never in a million years want to be in that state of doubt. Those things kind of just happen to you, right? And we'll talk more about that. Now, there is a misconception about doubt. If you're going through doubt, that must mean that you're not a very good Christian. Okay? You're a bad Christian. That's what some people think. That is a myth. That is a misconception, okay? It turns out, and this could be true, that the person going through doubt actually is a stronger Christian. And here's why. Because the Christian that has a deep faith often will think very deeply about their faith. And as you begin to think very deeply about your faith, something happens. You begin to ask really deep questions. And as you start to ask those really deep questions, sometimes something else happens. You start to have those deep doubts. Okay, you see the chain that happens there? The person that doesn't think very deeply, well, they're not going to question as deeply, and then maybe they don't end up having those doubts come along. So we shouldn't judge. We shouldn't point the finger and say, oh, because you're doubting, you're not a strong Christian, or you don't have a deep faith. I know people that go through very deep seasons of doubt, and they're some of the strongest, deepest thinkers that I know and want to walk with God, but they have some questions, and we'll talk about that as we go here. Okay. So that's one misconception that we need to be familiar with. Now, if you want to know how to deal with doubt and doubt towards God, we need to understand the sources of doubt. And there are more, but just for the sake of time, let's look at these three broad categories. There's emotional doubts, there's volitional doubts, doubts of the will, and there's doubts of the intellect, intellectual doubts, okay? And these are all different categories, and how you respond to each of these doubts, someone going through them, is going to look very different, okay? So for example, emotional doubts. Emotional doubts result from things like experience of pain, suffering, bitterness, broken relationships, maybe hurt, abuse, fear, depression, anxiety. All of these things can lead to what can be kind of broadly called emotional doubts. Now, emotions are powerful. Like, emotions can easily overpower our reason, right? Consider the fear of flying. Does anyone want to admit that they have a fear of flying? No one here. Okay, one person. Okay, good. And look, my first flight wasn't until I was like 18 years old, okay? And we would drive to Florida. We didn't have a lot of money, so we would drive to Florida, and then my parents were like, you know what, we're gonna try flying. And I'm thinking, a plane in the air? Like, I don't think so, And so take the fear of flying, for example. It doesn't matter if you understand the physics of flight. It doesn't matter if you understand the engineering that goes into an aircraft. It doesn't matter if you understand the statistics on how it is safer to fly in a plane than to drive in your car. You can know all of that stuff. But when you are sitting in your seat with the engines running, none of that matters, right? None of it matters. And it doesn't help with the person sitting next to you and with a physics degree saying, well, you just got to understand how the wind is going to, and that you're going to be like, leave me alone, right? What you want in that moment is not someone to give you textbook information or statistics. What you want is that person to hold your hand, if you know them, hold your hand and say, it's going to be okay. We're going to get through this together, right? Your response is going to look different. So it's not an intellectual thing. It's an emotional thing. Maybe some of the intellectual stuff may help. Oh, maybe if I understood the statistics or whatever, maybe that helps, but maybe it doesn't. And so again, if someone is going through doubt and that you identify it as emotional doubt, make sure you're responding to that appropriately, not giving an inappropriate response, okay? All right, so that's emotional. How about volitional doubt? Volitional doubt is doubt of the will, okay? This is when our will and desires clash with God's will and desires, Okay, when this happens, we begin to doubt God's will for our lives. Okay, so there is a clash of these wills. We see volitional doubt creep in when we think that we know better than God. And I mean, I know we don't want to admit that, but sometimes we can act and think that way. We think our way's better than God's way, so God better get out of the way. So here's just an example. Imagine an 18-year-old Christian girl grows up in the church, goes off to college. She meets a boy. Now she falls in love with this boy. She loves this boy. She loves spending time with him. Their relationship is growing. And after a few months, she decides she wants to have sex with her boyfriend. But she knows that's not God's will for her. She knows God's will for her is that sex is between a man and a woman in marriage. Now there's a tension. There's a desire that she has, but she knows God's desire, and when there's a tension, something's got to give. And so, and this happens in some cases, rather than submit our lives to God's will, we say, no, I know what's better for my life. I'm going to live my way. And so to avoid the tension, what do? You get rid of God. And I know people that have got rid of God. I mean, they didn't really get rid of him, but they claim that he's not there anymore so they can live the way they want to live. That would be under this example of volitional doubt. In fact, when you talk to some of these people, they describe their deconversion as liberating. It's freeing. That's how they describe it. Here's an example. Rachel Slick. She is the daughter of a pretty prominent Christian apologist, okay? Now, Rachel Slick wrote about her deconversion in an article that went viral a number of years ago on the internet. And the title is called "The Atheist Daughter of a Notable Christian Shares Her Story." Now, I want you to listen to what she says here. She says, "Someone once asked me if I would trade my childhood for another if I had the chance. And my answer is no, not for anything. My reason for that, my reason is that without that childhood, listen, I wouldn't understand what freedom truly is. Freedom from a life centered around obedience and submission, freedom to think anything, freedom from guilt and shame, freedom from the perpetual heavy obligation to keep every thought pure. Nothing I've ever encountered in my life has been so breathtakingly beautiful. Listen, freedom is my God now, and I love this one 1,000 times more than I ever loved the last one." So you see the clash of wills there, right? She knows, she grew up where she understood God's will, at least to some extent. God wants these other things. I don't want those things. I want freedom from those things. And this is what, and so she's turned her life away from God. Okay, so that's just a quick example of volitional doubt. So you got emotional doubts, you have volitional doubts. And by the way, sometimes these things are all kind of interwoven together, okay? And we'll see that with intellectual doubt. Intellectual doubt. So this is the kind of challenges that come when you don't believe or start to doubt whether something is true or not, okay? There's an intellectual doubt. Now, I want to jump back to Rachel. Now, you don't have to read any of this, okay? I just took a screenshot of her deconstruction testimony because I'm going to read something kind of long here, and I just want you to listen, okay? So Rachel just described a volitional doubt, but she also describes an intellectual doubt, okay? And here's what she says. So this is Rachel again. She says, "This changed," that is her certainty about Christianity, "one day during a conversation with my friend Alex. I had the habit of bouncing theological questions off him, and one particular day I asked him this: if God was absolutely moral, because morality was absolute, and if the nature of right and wrong surpassed space, time, and existence, and if it was as much a fundamental property of reality as math, here's her question, then why were some things a sin in the Old Testament, but not a sin in the New Testament? And watch what happens. Alex had no answer, and I realized I didn't either. Everyone has always tried to explain the problem by using the principle that Jesus' sacrifice meant we wouldn't have to follow those ancient laws, but that wasn't an answer. In fact, by the very nature of the problem, there was no possible answer that would align with Christianity. Then she says, I still remember sitting there in my dorm room bunk bed, staring at the cheap plywood desk and feeling something horrible shift inside me. A vast chasm opening up beneath my identity. And I could only sit there and watch it fall away into darkness. The Bible is not infallible, logic whispered from the depths. I had no defense against it. If it's not infallible, then you've been basing your life's beliefs on the oral traditions of a Middle Eastern tribe. The Bible lied to you. Everything I was, everything I knew, the structure of my reality, my society, my sense of self suddenly crumbled away and I was left naked. I was no longer a Christian. That thought was a punch to the gut, a wave of nausea and terror. Who was I now when all this had gone away? What did I know? What did I have to cling to? Where was my comfort? I didn't know it, but I was free. You see how there's the freedom piece, but there's also this question that she thought you couldn't get an answer to. By the way, there's an answer to this question, okay? Now, she doesn't like the answer, but that's different than there not being an answer, okay? And we can address that at some point too. But the point is, there was an intellectual doubt involved in her other doubts that were going on. People like Lisa Gunger. Lisa Gunger was a part of a really big Christian music band called Gunger. Her and her husband, they were part of a mega church for a while. Her husband is now an atheist. She doesn't call herself an atheist. She said she tried atheism for a day, didn't like it. But she is certainly not an Orthodox Christian. And so she says here, actually in a discussion with Elisa Childers, who's written on progressive Christianity, she says this, there were some things I started questioning a little bit, but I was told you don't question. If you question the Bible, if you question the teacher or the pastor, then you are in essence sinning. So I shut down the questions that I had. This is tragic that this happens. We ought to be open to questions, especially sincere questions. I don't know why. I've been thinking a lot about deconstruction and questions and how Jesus used questions. And there are questions that seek answers. And there are questions that seek exits. And I think when it comes to the deconstruction movement, you see them both. You see questions that are seeking answers. They come to Jesus and say, what must I do to inherit eternal life? You know? And the rich man. And Jesus has this conversation, looks with pity on him. Of course, he walks away sad, right? Because he can't sell all that he has, if you know the story. But there are other questions in Scripture that aren't sincere, and it is very obvious. Like when they come to Jesus and they say, okay, a man has a wife, and then the man dies and she remarries. And then he dies and he's remarried. And 7 times this woman gets remarried. You know the story, right? The Sadducees. And the Sadducees are going to ask about who is she married to in the resurrection. Do you guys know the Sadducees don't believe in the resurrection? That's why they're sad, you see. That's a really bad line, but I think Norm Geisler used that once in one of my classes. The point is, these guys weren't asking a question. They were giving Jesus a riddle to try to stump him. That's what they were doing. Now, it's not as blatant usually, but you see those kinds of questions happening in these deconstruction stories. When someone comes to you and says, I would become a Christian if, you would answer this question. Can God make a stone so big that he can't lift it? And you're like, give me a break. That's a riddle. That's a puzzle. That's a game. You're not seeking truth here, okay? But we answered that question in Red Pen Logic, by the way. We got a video on that. So there's questions. Here's Marty Sampson, Hillsong. Now, I don't love Hillsong, but there is a song that Marty Sampson wrote called "Oh Praise the Name," and it is actually one of my favorite contemporary worship songs. Okay, like it's awesome. Marty Sampson went to social media a couple years ago and basically said, I'm out of this Christianity stuff. And one of the things he said in his Instagram post was, this is a soapbox moment, so here I go. That's kind of how they all start. I'm going to share this with you. How many preachers fall? Many. No one talks about it. How many miracles happen? Not many. No one talks about it. Why is the Bible full of contradiction? No one talks about it. I got a whole video on that. Some of us are talking about this stuff, okay? How can God be love yet send 4 billion people to a place all because they don't believe? No one talks about it. Maybe in the circles he was running in, no one was talking about it. But in the circles I run in, that's all we talk about, okay? That's my job to talk about those things. Okay, I got to keep moving here. Here's the thing. This kind of reminds me of this parable of this merchant, this peasant who had a donkey, loaded the donkey up with all this firewood strapped to his back, and then forced the donkey to carry the load up a long, steep path on a really hot day. Gradually, the animal slowed from exhaustion. Enraged, the merciless peasant began to beat the donkey harder and harder. Finally, the weight and the wounds took their toll, and the donkey drops to the ground in defeat. And then that's when the peasant beats the donkey to death. And the parable, I think, is akin to sometimes what happens with Christians. You see, we tell young Christians, or we tell Christians, don't doubt, have stronger faith, just believe, just suppress all that stuff, just keep believing. Yet they're wearing all these doubts, and they just accumulate, and all of a sudden they just collapse. I can't do it anymore. And then what do? Well, you were never saved to begin with. Oh, you're a horrible, this kind of thing. We beat them while they're down. I think we should take a lesson out of this parable. Now, here's the thing. The Bible has a lot to say about doubt. In fact, the Bible is full of doubters. The Bible's full of doubters, and I think we can learn from some of these doubters. The Bible's full of doubters. Abraham, Moses, Job. Tonight, I'm going to finish reading the book of Job as part of my Bible reading plan. David, Peter, Paul, Thomas, all doubted. So when you doubt, just know you're in very good company, okay? But I want to take a few minutes to talk about the greatest doubter in the whole Bible. Doubting John the Baptist. You guys knew that was coming. Doubting John the Baptist. What do you mean John the Baptist? John the Baptist is very interesting, a very fascinating case, because we don't often associate doubt with John the Baptist. After all, John has some serious religious credentials, right? I mean, think about it. He's the son of a priest. He's a prophet of God. He's Jesus' cousin. Now, if you're still unimpressed, this is the same John who at one time leapt in his mother's womb in the presence of a pregnant Mary. This is the same John who saw Jesus coming and said, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." Same John who baptized Jesus and heard a voice from heaven say, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased." Same John. And yet, we see John doubt. Where do we see that? Well, in Matthew 11, we see that John is arrested, thrown into a Roman prison, and it's not looking good. It's probably going to be executed. And he starts to wonder if he got it all wrong. And so he sends his disciples to Jesus. And it says in verse 2 and 3, Now when John heard in prison about the deeds of the Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said, here's the question, are you the one who is to come, or should we look for another? This is John. John, who was just, not that long ago saying, behold the Lamb of God. Wait, are you the guy? Are you the one? Here are some things we can learn from John. First, doubt out loud. If I was talking with my kids about this, I would want them to express their doubts. Don't suppress them. In fact, there was a big study done, a book called You Lost Me. David Kinnaman from Barna Research, president of Barna, he said, it's not doubt that's the problem, it's unexpressed doubt. We need to express our doubts. Doubt out loud. That's what John does. Follow John's example, okay? Sometimes we can be ashamed to admit that we have doubts, especially if you've been a Christian a long time, or if you got some role, like I'm the usher, I can't have doubts. I'm on the worship team, I can't have doubts. I'm the guy who stands up in front of it, I can't. Take it from John the Baptist. He's called the Baptist because he baptized Jesus, right? Take it from John, who had some pretty serious religious credentials. And yet he wasn't worried about his reputation. He cared about truth. Are we following the right guy or not? So we need to have some humility. Doubt out loud. But don't just doubt out loud, like run out to a field and, I don't know if you're there, God. Like, that's not going to work, okay? Like, I want you to doubt with others out loud, in particular with people that you trust. Don't just go to Instagram and start doubting. Find people in your sphere, in your life, that you can share your deepest doubts and questions with. For example, John the Baptist, in this phrase, he sent word by his disciples. That took guts. He couldn't leave to go talk to Jesus about the question. He had to trust his inner circle with the question to take it out. So my question to you would be, who's your inner circle? Who are the people that you can trust with your doubts and questions? There's kind of two sides to this, because I want to be the kind of person that people can come to with their doubts. So I'm not just going to express my doubts to people, but I want to be the kind of person that the people in my inner circle can come to and say, Tim, I'm struggling with this thing. And they're not going to get like extra condemnation or judgment or anything like that from me. I want to just walk with them through it. Just like John's friends did, I think. There's a reason that in Jude, verse 22, it says, have mercy on those who doubt. It's like Jude knew, you know what? People might be merciless. Let's remind them to show mercy. Okay, so doubt out loud, doubt with others. The third thing is understand your doubts and their implications. Understand your doubts and your implications. I think John does a good job at this. He knew what he was doubting, and he knew what he wasn't doubting. What do I mean? Well, John doesn't doubt God's existence. He doesn't doubt the authority of Scripture. He doesn't doubt that there's a promised Messiah coming. No. His doubt is very specific. Are you the one, or should we look for another? He doesn't question his foundation. Why do I make this point? Because oftentimes someone will get in their minds a single question, and then the whole thing crumbles. That is not a good way to doubt. I don't want to sound insensitive, but it's an overreaction. And when Rachel describes, I read her testimony, her deconversion testimony to you, when she says, everything I was, everything I knew, The structure of my reality, my society, my senses suddenly crumbled away. I was left naked. I was no longer a Christian. After she had asked this question to Alex, everything was gone. To me, the connections aren't there. Some people, I don't want to get into debates, like in-house debates, but there are, debating the age of the earth, that kind of thing. Someone, decides, the earth isn't young or something, and all of a sudden they go straight to atheism, as if that means God doesn't exist, or it means that Jesus didn't rise from the dead. You know what I'm saying? Even in Rachel's case, she's talking about the Bible being whatever it is. She's mentioned infallibility. It's no longer infallible. Why? Because we can't answer this question. But even if she's right that the Bible isn't infallible, I believe it is. Even if she's right it isn't, that wouldn't mean God doesn't exist. It wouldn't mean Jesus didn't rise from the dead. I mean, there's so many things that just simply do not follow from that conclusion or that assertion she had. So we gotta understand your doubts and their implications. And then once you understand your doubts, do your best to answer your doubts, okay? Answer your doubts. How does that look? Well, it may look like putting it in terms of a question and asking it. I think this is what John does. Are you the one, or should we look for another? Listen to what Jesus says. Jesus says, go tell John what you have heard and seen. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised up, the poor have good news preached to them. Jesus doesn't tell John to look inside his heart for some subjective feeling. He doesn't tell John to ignore his doubts and just blindly believe. Rather, Jesus points to objective evidence. Look what I have done. What's the evidence? Blind people are seeing. Deaf people are hearing. Dead people are being raised. That kind of thing. Let me give you a quick example of this from my own personal story. So 2018 was a horrible year for our family, okay? We lost 3 family members and a close friend. My mentor from when I was teaching at this Christian high school, he was the chaplain. He introduced me to much of the apologetics world, okay? Like, I owe him so much. He got brain cancer at 38, and in 2018, took his life. My father-in-law, we were in Jamaica in February of 2018. He was gone by August. We got back from the trip. He was rushed by ambulance a couple days later. Turned out he had a massive tumor inside him that we didn't even know about. And there was nothing they could do. And so 6 months gone. Went from healthy man to 200-pound man to 125 pounds by the end of it. Didn't even look like the same person. 64 years old. My grandfather, who was not a Christian his entire life, and my dad, had a kind of a rough upbringing with his dad. And my dad came to the Lord through my mom. So our family are Christians kind of through my mom's side, not my dad's side. And I get a phone call, just to kind of speed things up. I get a phone call from my mom. She says, your grandpa's in the hospital, and it's not looking good. Now, this was on a Thursday, and I was flying out the next day to go to Dallas to speak at an apologetics conference, okay? So that Thursday, we pick up the kids from their school, we start driving to the hospital. And we're trying to prep my kids, this is probably the last time you'll see your grandpa, that kind of thing. Not a great, or their great grandpa, my grandpa. And one of my daughters says, oh, don't worry, we'll see grandpa in heaven. And I'm just like, I'm a mess, I'm just a mess. Well, when I got that call in that morning from my mom, I hung up the phone, and I'm not making any of this up. I prayed. I said, God, help me to talk to my grandpa today. Give me courage. Give me boldness. I'm going to be in a room. I know how this works. We've lost other people. I've been in the room when there's 30 people. You know what I'm saying? And everybody, and aunts and uncles, and everybody's there. And now Tim, the Christian's going to just, excuse me, everyone. I'm thinking, how's this going to go? So give me courage. Sometimes it's the hardest thing to do is talk to your own family, right? I can go talk to you guys, bring me the atheist, whatever, let's go. But when it's my grandpa, who, I grew up watching America's Funniest Home Videos on the couch with, you know what I'm saying? It's a little different. And we get there, and elevator doors open, all these people, all my relatives are there, like 30 of them. And we're like, why aren't you guys in the room? Oh, well, they're doing another test on grandpa, something to do with his kidneys. Okay. So they end up wheeling my grandpa past my kids' wave. Actually, that was the last time my kids saw their great-grandpa. Because we ended up leaving. The test was going to take an hour. So we ended up going, and I got home, dropped the kids off, and my wife's like, you got to go back. So I turned around and drove back to the hospital. Get there. I actually picked up my sister on the way. We get there, and the doors open again. No one's in the lobby. And I'm like, oh, no, they're all in the room. We go to the nurse. Okay, what room's he in? Oh, you can't go in there. What do you mean I can't go in there? Well, we've discovered, I don't know how this worked, tuberculosis was like, there was some kind of tuberculosis scare. They identified it somehow. I don't know how this works. But they're like, you can't go in there because there's tuberculosis. And I'm like, well, lady, we're going in. Like, try to stop us. That kind of thing. And she's like, okay. So after, this comes to the whole pretend like you're a lawyer and debate people or be the apologist. So I made my case. I said, I'm going in. We put on, this is before COVID, we put on everything. The mask, the shield, the hairnet, I don't know why I had it, the everything, like even like a gown thing, like I'm going to do a surgery or something, gloves. We walk in, my grandpa's sleeping there. My sister and I are looking at him. And so we go, so the other part, everyone went for dinner. All like 30 of my relatives all went for dinner because of this tuberculosis thing. And anyways, my grandpa wakes up. I'm kind of spending too much. Is it okay if I use this? Okay, because I'm going to do it anyways. He wakes up, and I just went right after it. Just said, Grandpa, I leave tomorrow morning early. I need to know. I need to tell you one last time about eternity and what it's going to be like if you do not accept Christ and what it will be like if you do accept Christ. You just need to know all the facts. I won't be able to sleep tonight unless I get this off my chest. Went through the gospel. My grandpa seemed really receptive. And I was like, something's off, like maybe I should say it again. Now, he was fully there. I mean, it was just one of those weird moments where he was just, I guess when you're like on your deathbed, priorities change. And, you're looking for a lifeline. And we ended up praying with him, and it was amazing. Like, he received Christ. It was a miracle as far as I'm concerned. I know, like, people want to see arms grow back and this kind of thing for miracles. But to me, this is exactly what I asked God for that morning. And I saw no way in which this goes down. I had an hour and a half with my sister in the room talking with my grandpa about nothing but Jesus. That is the only time that has ever happened in the history of our relationship with my grandpa, okay? I say all that because the next day I'm driving to the airport and I am overwhelmed with feelings of doubt. The question keeps coming, Tim, who are you to share about eternal life with a dying man? Like, where do you get off? You know what I'm saying? Like, I'm in my 30s. What do I know? Who are you to tell this guy where he's going to go if he accepts Christ, if he's going to believe? And I'm just like, oh my, how do I know this? And it was almost paralyzing. Honestly, I was broken up by it. But what I did was, just like Jesus answered John's doubts, Go and tell John what you've seen and heard. What do I know? I know truth exists. How do I know truth exists? Well, to deny truth, you have to affirm it. I know God exists. How do I know God exists? I've looked into some really powerful arguments, compelling arguments for God's existence. I know the Bible's reliable. How do I know that? I mean, I've done the work here. And I just started going through. How do I know my grandpa's going to be in heaven? Because that's what Jesus said. He said he's the resurrection and the life. And he backed it up by raising himself from the dead. You know what I'm saying? So I answered my doubts. Understand your doubts and then answer them. And by the way, I'm sitting on a plane. I got through security and all that stuff. I'm on the plane. Get a message from my mom. Your grandpa's gone. And it turns out we were like the last people that talked to him. My grandma went in afterwards, but even my dad didn't go in. They wouldn't let people in. And they got pretty serious about it after we left. Okay, number 5. Jesus, and this is kind of like the broad point that we take from this story, is Jesus can handle your doubts. Jesus can handle your doubts. I love how when you read Matthew chapter 11, go read the whole chapter, but Matthew chapter, after John has already asked the question, are you the one or should we look for another? Jesus turns to his disciples and basically pays John the greatest compliment anyone could ever receive. He says, truly I say to you, among those born of women, there has arisen no one greater than John the Baptist. He doesn't condemn John. He doesn't say, oh man, that's John. He just couldn't handle it, you know. His suffering, his whatever, he's a doubter now. No. Jesus could handle your doubts. In fact, he pays him this incredible compliment. Okay, last story, and then we'll take your questions. So I have a friend who used to fly for Air Canada. Before that, and now he's retired, but before that he flew CF-18s for the Royal Canadian Air Force, okay? These really cool fighter planes. And he told me that you can become very easily spatially disoriented when you're flying 1,000 miles per hour, 30,000 feet above the earth. Really easy to become spatially disoriented. In fact, during one training mission, flying over northern Canada, he said that his co-pilot and him were flying, and the co-pilot was supposed to put the plane into kind of an evasive maneuver, and Mike, my friend, his job was to kind of restore the plane, not restore, but you know what I'm talking, recover the plane from the maneuver. So they end up doing this maneuver. And then the co-pilot says to Mike, are you okay? And Mike's like, yeah, I'm fine. Why? What's wrong? And the co-pilot says, because we're flying upside down. We're flying upside down. See, my friend Mike, he had confused the lights on the ground for stars. And he was kind of trusting his gut instead of trusting in his instruments. In fact, on the phone, he said, if you trust your gut, you trust your feelings over your instruments, you'll never make it as a pilot. You got to trust, because just as you can become spatially disoriented, you can become very easily spiritually disoriented by our questions and our doubts. And when that time comes, we need to be anchored to reality in some way. We need to trust our instruments. For Mike, it was, the control panel or whatever. When we refer to Christian faith, what is our anchor? What's anchoring our faith? I don't want my kids, I don't want my faith to be their anchor for their faith. That's not going to work. It's just not going to work long term. Okay? It can't be their friend's faith. It can't be your friend's faith, right? You need something lasting, something anchored to reality. Take it from John the Baptist, who had plenty of experiences of God, right? Those won't sustain you. For some of us, that's bad news. Some Christians started out believing for the wrong reasons. And if you start badly, you're likely going to finish badly. It's like when you start, I'm not wearing a collared shirt, but the guys know what I'm talking about. When you start buttoning at the wrong button, what happens? The wrong all the way down, right? You start bad, you finish bad. If you can't give a why to your faith, you'll never be able to give a why not to your doubts. In other words, if you don't have a Christian faith anchored to what's true, then you'll always be at the mercy of your doubts. So I think it's time that we all examine the foundations of our faith, because a strong faith requires a strong foundation. Okay, let me pray and then we'll take questions. Father, we're so grateful for an evening together where we can look at a really important subject, a topic that is affecting so many in the church right now. God, I pray that you would give us wisdom in conversations with people who are struggling with doubts. I pray you'd give us grace to be there and understand where they're coming from and empathize with them as they go through a season of doubt. God, I pray you would use us to restore them to stronger, more robust faith on the other end of their doubts. We pray this in your name. Amen.
Amen. All right. Thank you,
Oh,
Tim. I snuck behind you.
Wow, you sneaky.
Turn me down there, Brandon.
There you go.
All right. Well, I'm going to give you guys a second to think of a question. And while you're thinking of that, if you would answer Rachel's question, why are some things a sin in the Old Testament and not in the New Testament?
Okay, so that's a really good question. There's kind of some multiple parts to this. The first thing is, when she describes things being a sin in the Old Testament, I would want to use a clarifying question. We talked about tactics this morning with the young people. And so one of the tactical approach is to ask questions. So I would want to know what she's referring to. Like when she talks about like murder in the Old Testament is still murder in the New Testament. So is she referring to like the ceremonial laws, which are different than sins, okay? There were things that made you unclean, but they wouldn't be moral sins like we see with murder or adultery or something like that, okay? There were things that just made you unclean, and what you would do is you would do something to become clean. And so whereas sin, there was different punishments for that. So the first thing is I would look at the Old Testament law and I would want to say, okay, first of all, are these moral sins? Well, they're not all moral. Some are moral. And those, by the way, are universal and carry over to the New Testament. Those don't change, okay? But there are some things like dietary laws, okay, that it wasn't a sin to eat pork, but God had commanded them not to do that, just keep them separate, to keep them Israel as a nation separate from the other nations. And so when Jesus shows up, he says, guess what? All things are clean because God made them all. And so there isn't a moral change there. So that might be the misunderstanding. So she thinks, oh, if I eat pork, it's a sin. Now it's not a sin. Morality has somehow changed. No, that's not how it worked. There's another aspect to this. We read when Jesus asks about divorce and remarriage, what does he say? He says, it wasn't like that from the beginning, but because of the hardness of your hearts, God gave you this right to divorce. So it turns out there are some things in the Old Testament, Old Covenant, that aren't God's ideal. He did them, he set certain laws up because of their hardness of heart, okay, to kind of restrict some of their immoral behavior, this kind of thing. But that wasn't the ideal. Jesus says, no, the ideal was go back to Genesis chapter 2. God made them male and female. And what God's joined together, let not man separate. So there's a number of different things. So the question can't just be answered in a soundbite. Maybe we'll do a full red pen logic video on it. That would require some time. But what you need to know is the Old Covenant is a separate covenant from the New Covenant. It's just like Canada. We have rules, you have rules. Now, it turns out we have some of the same rules, like murder rules against murder, right? You come to Toronto, you try to kill someone, you can't say, well, I'm from Ohio. No, they're going to say there's a universal moral law, and it's represented in both our countries. But there are some rules that Canada has that you probably don't have, like killing a goose. That's like our bird, okay? But you guys probably go out with your shotguns and take out geese like crazy, right? Well, there's certain, but there's those kind of weird laws, right? And I was reading the other day about you can't pull a cow through a town, and they're these old 18th century laws, and they came up with them just because they were responding to something happening in that time and place. We read about that law and we're like, why is that a thing? But it's still in the books. You know what I'm saying? And I think there's some of that going on in the Old Testament too. So that aren't necessarily moral stuff, but it's here's how you're going to live. Because remember, it was a theocracy. God was in charge. And that's why you basically get a criminal code along with the religious stuff. The priest and the police were kind of the same person, okay? There was no separation there. Of course, the New Covenant is completely different. So that's kind of a start to that question. But I would need to know way more information. She kind of just states it there's no way to settle this. If God said, thou shalt not murder, and then all of a sudden Jesus is going around saying, go ahead and murder people, okay, I'd see a problem there. But it's that kind of thing you just don't see.
Okay. We'll open it up if you have a question tonight in the back.
It's like in our standard laws around here in the land.
Yeah.
They say that case law overrides statutory law.
Okay.
But from what I've understood in the, if you look at the laws in the scripture,
yeah.
Really, if you were to take every statutory law, it would spell out what the case law says. A case is a certain scenario.
Okay.
But if you were to look at the various statutes and apply them to each, you would see that would say the same thing as what case law is stating.
Okay.
But when you try to teach that to someone, how do you go about it?
I don't know if I fully understand so when you read through maybe you could give me an example, that would help.
Okay, well, for example, in the Old Testament, it says if someone kills someone, and it was intentionally, it's life for life. He's to be stoned or killed.
Yeah.
But if he did it unintentionally, or if someone it was in retaliation to something, then it's different.
Yeah.
It's a case.
They give all kinds of details. Right. That's right. Yeah. I was reading the other day in Leviticus, and similarly, it's talking about incest. There's a whole chapter, and it doesn't just go through. It could just say, just don't sleep with someone who's related to you. But it's going through. If it's your stepdaughter, if it's your stepmother, it's just every single person you could possibly, your brothers, that's right. It just goes through that. So I think the Bible, it does go into those kinds of details. And I think people can get lost in the weeds there. What I think we need to, as New Testament, New Covenant Christians, when we look back at that, we should try to understand the historical context, okay, what's going on at the time, but what are the broad moral principles, if there are any, in play in those individual cases, right? And surely in that chapter on incest, that's what it's talking about, but if you were living in that time, I haven't read the Canadian Criminal Code, since high school when we kind of studied law or whatever. But they go through very specific details, because all kinds of weird stuff happens, and then if something new, they add it in there, and sometimes that's not for the the good. There's some new stuff that was added like this month in Canadian criminal law, where if I made some claims, like what I think are just Christian claims about transgenderism or homosexuality, I could end up getting thrown in prison, okay? If what they, it has to do with conversion therapy and what the definition is, and there's now it's now in the criminal code, So anyways, that's a side thing. But you're right, there is case law, and there's also these broader universals that I think we can.
I understand, like if you were to take all the different statutes,
Yeah.
you would find that like the case law is in this scenario, in this case, but if you look at this other statute and you put them all together, the statutes, if you apply every statute to the case or that scenario, it actually will say the same thing.
Yeah. I think you're right about that. You're not going to see a contradiction or inconsistency there. So that's a good point.
Well, we can take a few more questions. So I'm sure the kids workers are cool staying back there a little longer. I got you, Doc. I'm coming.
I think what we have, a lot of times what we have to realize is we are working toward a scale of maturation in Christianity.
Yeah.
And we've got to realize that Christ is not the king of this world. The devil still rules. And there's a little devil sitting here, and there's one sitting over here, and you've got to realize where your priorities are. And sometimes that's very, very, very difficult to do.
Yeah.
Especially when children are growing up they're the most vulnerable
Yeah.
to everything that we're not to do and we're not to have.
And that's a whole other dimension to this. We talk about doubts and them being, it seems like they're just, it's just a question. There's a whole spiritual kind of war going on here. What's interesting, though, is when Paul talks about the spiritual battle that's being waged in 2 Corinthians chapter 10, he says the weapons of our warfare, spiritual warfare, are not of the flesh, but have divine power to destroy strongholds. And then he says what the strongholds are. He says, we destroy arguments and every lofty opinion raised against the knowledge of God and take every thought captive to obey Christ. There is a battle of ideas that's going on in our world right now. You're right. Satan is prowling around like a roaring lion, and he is influencing, I think, when it comes to ideas. I mean, some ideas, you just want to call them demonic because they're so, it's just like, wow. But we know that this is going to happen. Jesus talked about it. The Bible kind of gives us an insight into the world that we are going to be living in. So we shouldn't be surprised by it, okay? Tomorrow morning, I'm going to talk about false ideas about God. And we're going to be looking in the scriptures and how to guard our lives against false ideas. And like the spoiler is, we go back to God's word because only God gets to tell us who God is like. But there are lots of ways false ideas creep in. It started in the Garden of Eden. There's Satan. Did God really say? Did God really say? Right? And then he moves from there. God didn't say that. You won't die. There's a whole progression. We're going to talk about this tomorrow.
Cool.
So that's a good segue.
All right, last one. You had a question? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Sorry about that. We just got to make sure that
He's a rule follower.
people on Facebook can hear.
I'm not a rule follower. So my question is, as I, generationally,
Yeah.
I grew up in a Christian home.
Yeah.
I think for the most part my parents did as well. As I look around at my kids and the kids that are in their generation, I see an erosion of the spiritual depth, I guess, of my generation, the parents that the parents and grandparents. How much of what you run into as you go about this apologetic process is not necessarily an erosion of these deep spiritual people that you talked about, the doubts, right?
Yeah.
But it's really it's a very thin spiritual worldview, right? So it seems to me that the erosion is happening because the depth of the parents, my generation, is
Yeah.
not very deep. And so we don't have I love the foundation slide. We don't
Foundation.
have that foundation. Do
Yeah.
you see that?
Yeah, I think it's a huge issue. As I think about deconstruction, deconversion, all that stuff, doubts, one of the things, and I talked about this morning, deconstruction assumes that there was something, if you're going to deconstruct, you assume something was constructed, right? And what's interesting is, I think for some people, they're deconstructing things that were never constructed. They were just given the thing. So I tell people, I came to believe in God because my parents told me when I was very young that God exists. It was like, here's this belief, God exists. And I said, okay, sure, right? But they also said Santa is real, you know? I said, okay. And I came to believe that that's not true. And so I started asking, we asked questions about Santa. It's like, how did he get around the whole world in one night? That kind of thing. You start to doubt. And the same thing happens with God, and when there isn't a foundation there, there's nothing there. It was just here. And now I'm like, yeah, but I just saw this YouTube video that says evil and suffering means God can't exist. Or, whatever the challenge may be. And so I think there's a huge problem. And it is kind of generational. Although that's not, I don't want to play the blame game with parents. Everybody is their own individual. My parents didn't know anything about apologetics. They didn't know anything about answering questions. I discovered this stuff in my 20s and was like, where was this my whole life? Yet I grew up in the church. The doors were open, we were there, that kind of thing. And yet I didn't know any of this stuff. It wasn't until I got challenged in university by some friends about what I believed. And the best I could do was, well, I'm a Christian because my parents are Christians. That's what I actually said. And when you get embarrassed like that, it's like, okay, time to go home and start Googling, and sure enough, I found some guys that were Christians, and they were intellectual, and they thought through this stuff, and that really helped me. It wasn't my family, they love what I do, they're encouraging, they're awesome, praying for me, but I can't go to them when it comes to my questions. They just don't have it, the foundation. I go to them for other reasons. So I don't want to beat you guys up or anything because you're not like experts in all this stuff. Nobody is, okay? But we ought to know who the experts are and go to them, But we need solid foundation or we're going to end up in trouble. And I've just been thinking about this analogy in my head. It's like ice hockey, play on the pond. When we're out on the pond, we would just go out. We got our skates on, got our sticks, we just go out on the pond, when we were with my dad. But he knew, he would check the thickness of the ice. It was, especially the early season, we were never allowed to run out there without him first, like making sure there was a foundation. And I think there's something similar there. There's a good analogy where I don't want my kids leaving my house without knowing who Richard Dawkins is and his arguments, or Bart Ehrman and his arguments. There's these guys who are out there who are writing books and they're bestsellers and they're just picking us off one by one because Christians grew up in the church, have no idea why they believe what they believe. Then they read Bart Ehrman, who's a New Testament scholar, who's written all this stuff about how you shouldn't trust the Bible, Jesus isn't God, all this stuff, and these people walk away. And then you watch their YouTube videos, and their book recommendations are Bart Ehrman, Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, all these guys. Okay, can I do one more illustration?
Yeah. The
Okay.
children's workers will probably kill me, but that's okay. You get to go back to Canada. I got to stay here.
Okay, last thing. This is going to stick in your mind for the rest of your life. In Arizona, there's something called the Biosphere 2. They made a movie called Biodome. Do you remember that?
Yeah, I remember that.
Yeah. Pauly Shore.
Yeah, Pauly Shore.
Horrible movie, but Biodome, okay? Biodome. This thing was supposed to be like, hey, if we were going to Mars, build a dome, we want an ecosystem that we could survive in. Plants, animals, humans, you name it, okay? They built this thing. They put people in there. It didn't go very well, but what they noticed was the trees, everything, like they had the auction right, I mean, all the different parameters. The trees, though, would grow up, and when they hit a certain height, they would fall over. They just fall over. Like, what's going on? We got the right soil. We got the right atmosphere. We got the right light. What's the problem? They didn't account for something. Wind. The biodome is completely enclosed. There was no wind. It turns out, for a tree to grow deep roots, it needs wind pushing against it. Although the tree in the parking lot had too much wind.
Yeah.
Okay?
That's Mike's tree.
Yeah. So, but you guys get the point. We, I think, as Christians, isolate our kids, right? We want to keep them away from the world. We want to protect them. Christian school, Christian this, Christian that, Christian. And there's nothing wrong with that. My kids go to a Christian school, okay? But we need to expose them to a little bit of wind so their roots grow deeper. Read the parable of the soils. You'll find out why some fell away. Jesus says they had no root in themselves, okay? So kind of a partying idea there. Make sure your kids have a foundation or deep roots. And that may mean you having to grow your roots deep too at the same time. Just stay, as a professional teacher, used to do this for a living, just stay one day ahead of them. That's all you got to do, okay? I taught, like, what do they call it? Not home ec. It was like that. They had me teaching at this Christian school, this class, and I was totally unqualified to teach it. And family studies. I had, like, just got married, so that's all we talked about was my marriage every class. But I just stayed one class ahead of them. And they'd be like, well, Mr. B, what about this? I'd be like, let me find out. Come back tomorrow, you know? So there you go. And you guys can do the same thing. Your kids got questions? Red pen logic.
There you
Stand to
go.
reason. We'll hook you up.
8:45 tomorrow. If you want to come and ask some questions,
Yeah.
Tim will be in the basement with Uncle Dave's small group. And then 10 o'clock and 6 p.m. tomorrow. See you guys. Have a good one.
Were the kids running wild out there?
I don't know. Not my problem. Not right now, at least.
The workers are tied up, but they're okay.
They're tied up, but they're okay.
Yeah, that's right.
This is my twin brother, Brian.
No way.
Yeah,
I teach 7th grade math.
Hey, how's it going?
he knows your pain.
Professional teacher.
Very,
Yeah.
very cool.
I'm public school though, so a
Well,
little
I
more
was
dangerous.
in a public school for a couple years too,
Yeah.
and that was hard. I don't know what it's like here, but we took a lot of abuse, you know,
Yeah.
from students. Being in a Christian school, I never thought I'd teach in a Christian school, but that's where I was able to find a job right away. And it was hard, you know.
Brent,
Yes.
Brandon,
Nice to meet you. Thanks for coming out. Great having you with us tonight.
thank you.
Well,
That was great.
did you check the score?
Oh yeah, I did.
What's the score?
26-19 Bengals.
Oh.
2:35 left.
Who has the ball?
Bengals.
Oh.
26-19.
It's getting intense. Thanks for coming tonight.
Thanks.
Pleasure having y'all.
I don't know if you are 20 minutes up there in Brown County or what? If 937 is from before you moved or
I live in Brown County,
Brown County?
south of Mount Orb.
Okay, because I was going to say if you're up to Dayton, you know some of our territory.
Okay.
I actually come from Greenville.
Greenville?
Yeah,
Oh.
just northwest of Dayton.
Yeah, I know Greenville
And then
really well.
these two, the lady who just walked down there, Plain City. Plain City towards Columbus.
Oh, okay. Hey, you guys drove a ways. Thanks for driving so far.
Yeah.
It was great having you.
Thank you.
If you get a chance, come back tomorrow. It's a bit of a drive, I understand.
For tomorrow.
I understand. Well, it's good having you. Thank you so much.